conference about the internet. What did you hear from the entrepreneurs and the Silicon Valley folks? What do they want from Washington? What is Washington not providing them, or what is Washington doing to them?
Well, there are a lot of things they're interested in, but the main thing I think that people in Silicon Valley are always cautious about is that government not over-regulate something as exciting and dynamic and relatively new as the internet is. It has grown, and people just are amazed to see every week the new applications that come out, the new websites that are available to them, and they want that to continue, and they think the best way to do that is to essentially allow free enterprise to work. So we discussed a number of topics related to issues that are of concern on the internet. I mean, people need to be aware of what happens on the internet is not all good. The types of crimes that occur in the rest of our society can occur on the internet, everything from fraud to child pornography to stalking to you name it. There's a way to do it in cyberspace, and the fact of the matter is we need to make sure that we are protecting people on the internet, but doing it in a way where we throw the book at the bad guys and not trying to regulate people who are trying to offer new and dynamic services on the internet. So that was a major topic. The conference was the State of the Net West, which is sponsored by the Congressional Internet Caucus, which is an organization that I am the Republican co-chair here in the House of Representatives. We have co-chairs in the House and the Senate. It's bipartisan and bicameral. There are close to 180 senators and House members interested in dealing with and promoting issues related to the internet. It's been around for more than a decade now, and it's a very valuable tool and one of the most active caucuses. You know, there's a caucus here in the Congress for just about anything you can think of, but some of them are just, well, somebody puts their name on it and, you know, they say they're a member of that caucus and they never see anything or do anything. But the Internet Caucus is very active. It has a professional staff, and it has numerous conferences here on Capitol Hill and around the country. This was an opportunity to reach out to folks on the West Coast, particularly in the Silicon Valley, where, of course, the internet is very much the heartbeat of that community, and hear from individuals and entrepreneurs and so on who are engaged in developing all these new and exciting things on the internet. Privacy was one of the issues we talked about, expanding the internet, broadband deployment, and so on. There are a lot of things that are of concern to people who are developing these technologies.
Well, as a member of the Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Immigration, tech companies are often talking to Washington about the visa and the immigration rules that Washington has set. Did you hear that from the Silicon Valley folks? Oh,
most definitely. What you find there is that the Silicon Valley and Northern Virginia, you know, right here across the river from the Capitol, are both areas where they utilize thousands and thousands of engineers and computer scientists, and they need to have people with the top skills in those areas. And we are very dedicated to making sure that American universities are turning out just as many of our young people who are interested in this technology and going to work in this area as possible. But it's also important that the companies be able to access the best and brightest minds from around the world.
So what's the solution?
Well, the solution is to make sure that we are focused on creating just as many American engineers and computer scientists and so on as we possibly can. They call it the STEM initiative: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We want to make sure that there's an emphasis not just in our colleges and universities, but from grade school on up in trying to interest American children in learning about this. And we're making progress in that area. Young people today, of course, have grown up with the internet, have grown up using computers from you know, age 4 and 5 onward, and so they're much more interested and much more proficient with the technology, and I think that source is going to be a constant tap, but we have to continue to nourish that and encourage it in our school systems.
What about from the immigration point of view?
We also need to make sure that we have immigration policies that meet that need. Now, we don't want to undercut the wage base in the United States. We don't want to, flood the country with people coming in simply to take a job that they might be willing to take less compensation for than an American citizen would. But there's no doubt that people come to our country to go to our colleges and universities, and when they do and they get that great American education, they want to stay here, and these companies want to hire them, and we need to make sure that we have a program that meets the demand for these engineers, because if we don't, in today's world markets, it is very possible to go to scores of other countries and build the same kind of companies that you see all across the United States, but particularly in places like Silicon Valley and Northern Virginia and Boston and Austin and many places around the country have become technology hubs. Even places in my district located near universities like Virginia Tech are creating lots of jobs, lots of businesses, employing millions of Americans. But if you don't have those best and brightest here doing that work here, and they go to India, they go to China, return in many instances to their home countries, go to Europe, wherever they might want to choose to live and create those businesses there, we lose that leadership in this area, and we are by far the world's leader in this technology.
Well, let's turn the questioning over to Greg Piper of the Washington Internet Daily.
Congressman, your son actually is a developer at Facebook, and so I'm wondering if what impact he's maybe had on your views. Do you talk about these issues with him regularly when there's something you're not quite sure what your position may be? Do you ask him for feedback, especially on issues like privacy, where you've said you don't really want to see law expand to a lot of the information that people are now posting on the internet, but rather limit it to sensitive things like health information and financial records? Do you think he's having an impact on you and maybe on larger Congress as their own children use these technologies?
Oh, I think so. In fact, one of the reasons why the Internet Caucus was formed was because members of Congress were coming from a generation that was not as steeped in Internet technology as younger people are. He's grown up with it. He's one of those people that I referred to. He has a degree in computer science, just started work in Silicon Valley, very excited about it, and one of the dynamic new companies out there, and he definitely has his points of view, as do a lot of my constituents, and it's important to get input from people who are actually engaged in developing the technology. Of course, all of us are using it now, but the people who are looking ahead, that next great application and so on, are important to me because they improve the quality of life of my constituents. I represent a district in the Shenandoah Valley that's rural and smaller cities, and it's a great opportunity because it used to be that you couldn't enjoy the quality of life you have in a place like that and do some of the great things that you had to be on Wall Street or inside the Beltway or in some other major urban area. You no longer have to do that. You can live where you want to live and be engaged in these types of technology development. But more importantly, you can be engaged in all the other sectors of our economy that utilize this technology, and it creates a better quality of life and better paying jobs for my constituents. On the other hand, if broadband doesn't reach out to the furthest corners of the country, those communities that are left behind are like those that were bypassed by the railroad in the 19th century. They become ghost towns, and so that's why this is important to me, not representing a major technology center like Northern Virginia or the Silicon Valley, but representing Middle America, and a beautiful congressional district with very hardworking people has the opportunity to benefit from this. So yes, we want input from those folks who tell us what the future is so we can make sure it reaches my constituents and others.
Okay. Well, let me ask you then about the Internet Access Tax Moratorium, which you were very instrumental in passing, another 7 years with no taxes. But you see a lot of pressure from governors, from state revenue officials saying that we're going to need to tax this right now. Our budgets are hurting quite a lot, and there's really no reason why it shouldn't. The Internet is just as big as it can be right now, and this is a really good revenue stream. How do you make the argument to them that no, you may still be harming the spread of this technology by taxing it?
Well, I think the key is to see who is utilizing the Internet and who isn't. These taxes, and we're not talking about sales taxes, by the way, that's a separate issue, and be happy to talk about that too, but we're talking about new and discriminatory taxes. The Internet Tax Moratorium applies to a tax that might be similar to a tax that's on your telephone. Well, we've seen what's happened to the conventional telephone. It's been in many respects in the process of being taxed into new and different areas, and we're seeing the technology gravitate toward the internet because of the fact that it's tax-free. And what it does is allow lower income people to be able to afford it. If you look at your phone bill, a huge percentage of it, probably 30–35% of a land-based telephone bill is now various types of federal, state, and local taxes. We don't want that to happen to the internet because it's a regressive tax that keeps lower income people from being able to participate. We just saw that last week China passed the United States in terms of having the most internet users of any country in the world. They have an advantage in that regard because they have 1.2 billion people, about 4 times the population of the United States. The United States is still the country that has one of the highest percentages of people utilizing the internet, but we're falling behind in terms of broadband usage of the internet. And the way to get there is not to impose new taxes on it. The way to get there is to open it up as easily as possible for the greatest number of people to participate, and I don't think that's a place to apply the taxes. So we were fortunate that there was strong bipartisan support in the Congress for the position I just described, and we extended the moratorium for 7 years, which is the longest extension it has ever experienced. I personally would like to see it extended permanently and have legislation to do so, and that has in fact passed the House of Representatives on a number of occasions but never passed the Senate. But the 7-year extension is a good start.
Congressman, you touched on a couple of issues. We interviewed FCC Chairman Kevin Martin recently on this program, and one of the things he talked about was the Universal Service Fund. I want to show a little bit of what he had to say and get your response to what he says.
The Commission gives out a significant amount of money already in our Universal Service Program. We give out several $billions a year to hook up schools and libraries and provide them with broadband access. And we also give out even more money to the rural program to make sure that people that live in rural areas can stay connected and have the same basic kind of service as people that live in urban areas. Increasingly, that's no longer a voice grade connection, but a broadband connection. And so I think we also need to reform our universal service policies so that we can more accurately target our resources, not just to voice grade connections, but really to broadband connections.
Well, that's a slightly different issue than simply taxing the internet for the purpose of garnering revenue to use for whatever purpose government might want to do. That is an issue of making sure that there's a fair allocation of the resources to reach into inner cities and to reach into the most rural areas by utilizing a universal service fund that sort of spreads the benefits that come on the internet. And I do agree that it would be appropriate for the Congress to review where we are on that fund, but it would, my support or opposition would depend upon how that reform took place and where the resources were going to be deployed, if they are deployed for the very specific purpose of making sure that more people are able to get onto the internet and to get high-speed broadband service. I think it's well worth looking at.
What about the white spaces issue, this spectrum that's being freed up with the digital television transition next year? Your colleague John Dingell, chairman of the House Commerce Committee, has said he would favor having that be licensed as opposed to unlicensed spectrum that would kind of be available just for people to use if they're using special devices made by Google or Microsoft or HP or even Philips. Is this something that you think there can be a compromise on between the licensed and non-licensed use, or is the spectrum likely to go one way or another, and where do you fall?
Well, I think that we need to make sure, first of all, that as we use that spectrum, and we should utilize it, that we're taking all the measures necessary to make sure that the people who are giving up that bandwidth or who are in adjoining bandwidth space, television, and radio broadcasters are two very key examples, are not receiving interference with this. And the testing of that is still not complete. But as we move forward in making sure that we are able to protect that space, then I think we need to be very creative in terms of how we make this available for use by people. And if a way can be found to make sure that the licensed spectrum holders are not impacted by the uncontrolled, unlicensed use of spectrum, we want to, I think, allow the internet to do what the internet does, and that is to create the sort of spontaneity that comes this way, and that is certainly with mobile use, that is certainly the next direction that we're headed. But with that one major caution that we've got to make absolutely certain that we're not interfering with the spectrum of those who are holding licenses on it. If we can't do that, then I certainly think we can still utilize the spectrum and generate some revenue from licensing it.
Okay. Let me ask you about internet gambling, which you were very instrumental in pushing through this ban a couple of years ago, but it's come under increasing fire from our trading partners, from the World Trade Organization, from some of your own colleagues, including Republicans, who are trying to basically weaken this ban or to limit its application, maybe to make an exemption for things like online poker. Do you think this ban can really go through and be implemented in the way the law was written, even as some of the agencies that are implementing it are saying it may be a little too vague to do? Is this going to be in the same form that it passed in?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that what the Congress passed was simply new tools for law enforcement, both at the federal and the state level, to enforce existing internet gambling laws. It does not define what is legal or illegal on the internet in terms of gambling. In fact, almost all the laws in the country, with the one or two exceptions, are state laws. Basically, gambling is illegal in the United States unless regulated by the states. The horse racing industry has a law that was passed a long time ago, back in the 1970s, that they maintain permits them to engage in taking bets on the internet. The Justice Department and other law enforcement entities dispute that, but it has never been tested out in the courts. This legislation was neutral on that question. It did not attempt to repeal the old law, but it also did not in any way give new guidance on what's legal and illegal. I had additional legislation that was a part of the original bill that would have modernized the Wire Act, which is the 1960s law that dealt mainly with telephonic placement of bets, calling a bookie and so on. That needed to be updated. It still needs to be updated, and I would support legislation that would allow for updating that. But I do think that gambling is something that the states are very protective of, because some states ban all forms of gambling. Some states allow almost all forms of gambling, and most states are in between, with allowing certain types and not allowing others. There are people who are opposed to gambling on the internet, like me, who want the states to be able to maintain the ability to decide for themselves what they're going to allow and not allow in their state. And there are other states that want to promote gambling and want to do it as a revenue source. Either way, I think there's going to be very strong resistance to the types of legislation that have been proposed in the Financial Services Committee. I do think that these new regulations ought to be allowed to go into play and to work. So far, we've been successful in keeping that on track to happen. I would not suggest that they couldn't use a lot of fine-tuning. They could, and they'll need to be done, but it basically relates to the requirement that the financial services industry cooperate with the Treasury Department and with law enforcement to make sure that money, and we're talking about billions and billions of dollars being sucked out of our country by these offshore, untaxed, unregulated sites that are illegal in the eyes of American law. So all that legislation did was give law enforcement and the states an additional tool to try to keep that money from going out of the country. It does not prohibit gambling on the internet, but it does say that you have to keep minors from being able to participate, and you have to keep the activity within the boundary of your individual state. Both of those are major technological challenges that the industry has so far not met. But if a state decided they want to allow poker playing or casino gambling or lotteries on the internet, and they are able to keep it within the confines of those two restrictions, that minors are clearly kept from being able to participate, and that they keep it within the boundary of the state, which is a major technological challenge, they can do that. It's not a gambling prohibition. It is simply a new tool for law enforcement to use. And all of the actions that have taken place thus far that have caused some concern in other countries and have been an issue in trade law and so on relate back to our earlier laws and our existing state laws, because this new law hasn't even been put into place yet.
Mm-hmm. Congressman, let's return to the spectrum broadly, if we could,
Sure.
for just a second. Recent spectrum auction not a lot of interest by communications companies, still no emergency communication system, nationwide communication system. How would you like to see that proceed to get to a national emergency communication system?
Well, I think we're going to have E911 legislation passed to enable that, and Congress needs to do that. We've been working on this for quite some time, and it's important because with the changing technology, the ability to have people get help with the minimum amount of inconvenience, the minimum amount of routing of the information, and the maximum amount of information about where they are and what their problem might be so that the correct help can be dispatched to them as quickly as possible should be included in any legislation like that. So the phone companies have done a great job with the traditional 911 system, which is up and operating and saves many, many lives, but with mobile telephony and the ability to know where people are when they call for help anywhere, out in the woods or in the middle of a mall or wherever they might be out during the day, not just in their homes. They should be able to be reached very quickly and identified where they are. Now that raises obviously a major privacy issue, and that is, okay, if that information is available to the emergency provider, when might it be abused by somebody who would be following somebody and keeping tabs on where they are based on the information that's being emitted from their phone. So first of all, you should be able to shut it off. If you don't want this service, it should be entirely voluntary, number one. And number two, there should be careful checks against abuse and clear prosecution of people who abuse what would otherwise be a clear invasion of people's privacy if they were to use this for other purposes. And law enforcement should abide by all the same rules that they have to abide by in terms of getting a search warrant and so on to locate somebody if they produce the evidence in court that this person is wanted and they are able to show that they have the evidence that's necessary to reach that standard that the court requires to go and apprehend somebody, then they should be able to get access to it, but only under those circumstances.
FCC Chair Kevin Martin also, in our interview with him, talked about nationwide wireless broadband access. Here's what he had to say.
What I had put forth was a plan that said that in the next auction that we were going to conduct, there's some additional frequencies that could be potentially utilized for wireless broadband services. That we should make a condition of that license, that whoever won the license, they should be required to provide a baseline basic broadband service to everyone throughout the country, and that they could do it on they could offer that on a free service. There are several companies that actually came to us and suggested that this might be a way to help us close the broadband gap. Broadband needs to be available throughout the country, and I think that wireless technologies is a good way to try to help close that broadband gap, particularly in rural areas where it can be very costly to build out wireline infrastructure.
Congressman?
Well, I think that's a very interesting proposal. I'm not prepared to endorse that particular suggestion. It's very similar to what is required now of telephone companies, and I think I don't know if it's federal or state, but of cable companies, that they provide a basic package that can be purchased at a lower cost. That's a very good thing. But there are going to be so many different providers offering so many different specialized services that whether or not that makes sense for every provider who has any access to spectrum to provide a specific basic package when they might be providing a service that is very highly specialized and targeted to a particular area of need would have to be examined in terms of how that would work in the larger picture. But the basic objective is a good one.
Let me ask you, speaking of some of the economic constraints that these access providers are under, some of them have been testing what's called behavioral targeting, which is the use of a customer's web traffic to target advertisements to them. A lot of these companies have said we need new revenue streams. We're not making any money on this, and if we want to be able to expand our service, especially to provide more bandwidth, then we need to be able to get another revenue stream. But this has been very controversial in Congress. Your colleagues on the House Commerce Committee have basically insinuated there's no way that a company can do this that will be protective of consumer privacy, and that really to this point has given them the kind of notice and consent that they would need. Is there any way that this kind of technology, this kind of targeting, would pass muster with Congress?
Well, I think so. I think there's two important things to keep in mind here. One is it's very important to protect people's privacy, but how you go about doing that is going to have a big impact on how the Internet grows and develops. And people who use the Internet more and more appreciate the fact that if the people who they're receiving services from know what they are interested in, that's going to increase the quality of the information about shopping, about entertainment, about business, about all the different education, all the different applications on the Internet are enhanced by doing that. However, there are areas that the Congress has already acted upon and probably will need to continue to review and act upon in the future that deserve a very different approach and very strong protection. Financial information, health information, and information about children are three very clear areas that Congress has already acted upon. We're seeing information come forward that maybe that protection is not as strong and comprehensive as it's been. There was a story last week in Business Week about the use of companies that gather information from various sources about people's prescription drug use and then sell that to insurance companies who can then turn around and utilize that information to make decisions about whether or not to offer coverage. That raises some alarms with many, including me, because we thought that that would be the kind of health information that would not be available in that form for, you know, a variety of different types of purposes like that, and consumers should be able to shield and protect that information. While it's useful information to have, it could be misinterpreted, and it's a clear invasion of their privacy. On the other hand, information about what your interests are in, you know, if you go on Amazon.com and they know that you bought a book about American history and you come on the next time and the first screen says, welcome Mr. Goodlatte, we have a new book about Henry Clay that we'd like to make available to you. Are you interested in buying this? You know, if I want to say no to that, I should be able to opt out. But I don't think we should have opt-in, which is that they have to get your permission before they tell you about anything they might think you might be interested in, because it'll slow down the information that's available. It's sort of like taking information out of the information age and the principal technology for delivering that information. If I buy a suit in a men's clothing store and the fellow happens to remember that I bought a certain type of suit and I had a certain size and so on, he writes that down and keeps that in his file, and then when that suit goes on sale, he calls me up and tells me that that's available. I think that's an opportunity. I'm not offended by it, but if some of his customers are offended, I'm sure he'll stop calling them to tell them about those kinds of opportunities. The Internet ought to operate the same way with regard to general commercial information. People should be able to opt out. The other part of this that's very important is education. Because of the capacity of the Internet to pull information from so many diverse sources and create a whole new profile about somebody that may not be as easily gatherable in the offline world, people need to be aware of that. And obviously, if it's used for nefarious purposes, fraud and so on, we should have clear laws that prohibit that and punish people for those kind of abuses. But I think this is a new area where we have to proceed with caution and not destroy what is one of the major benefits of the Internet, and that is people getting access to things they want to know about that they don't know exist. But in the Internet world, other people can pull that information together and let you know about opportunities that you might not otherwise have.
And finally, Congressman, in 30 seconds, is your district ready for the digital TV transition?
That's a very good question. I think that the overwhelming majority of Americans are now becoming aware of the fact that next February we're going to make this transition and are getting ready, but I am absolutely confident that there's a significant number of people out there who don't understand the implications, that if they have cable, if they have satellite service, or if they have a new TV that is digital ready, they're going to be fine. The transition will be seamless. But if they've got that television set that's from another era and they're using their rabbit ears or an antenna on the roof, they may be in for an unpleasant surprise. Or if they have everything else hooked up downstairs, but they've got another television set upstairs in the spare bedroom, they may find that that's not ready either. We have, as you know, a program to educate the public about this. A lot of television stations around America, including C-SPAN, television broadcasters, are making this information available to the public, and I think that's a very, very important thing to do so we don't get caught. And we also have a box where people can get a discount on that if they meet certain criteria, so they can be ready for this transition. It's important. It'll free up a lot of spectrum for a lot of new great uses, and the new digital technology is an enhancement of television itself. So it's important that we make the transition, but it's also important that everybody know what's going on.
Congressman Bob Goodlatte, a Republican of Virginia and co-chair of the Congressional Internet Caucus, has been our guest on the Communicators. We've been joined by Greg Piper, Washington Internet Daily Associate Managing Editor. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.